The movie begins in 1956, and we're in Chicago. There's this cozy little fashion shop that doesn't draw too much attention, and it's run by an old guy named Leonard Burling. Funny thing is, Leonard isn't originally from the US. He's actually from Britain. Back in the day, he worked at this super famous fashion store in London. But for one reason or another, he decided to pack up and move to Chicago. So, once he got to Chicago, Mr. Leonard opened up his own fashion spot. He had this lovely lady, Mabel Shawn, working with him. Now his clothes, super popular. A bunch of rich folks in Chicago made his place their go-to spot for shopping. One of these families, the Boyles, were more than just regulars. They're big shots in Chicago, known for their, let's say, shady business. They'd swing by Leonard's shop, not just to pick up some snazzy suits, but also to drop off letters in this mailbox Leonard set up. He thought having a mailbox was cool, because customers could leave messages or maybe a little something extra for good service. So, one evening, Richie Boyle, the only son of the big deal Boyle family, stopped by Mr. Leonard's shop. He wasn't alone though. He had Frances with him, someone super close to his dad. Even with these VIPs in his shop, Mr. Leonard was just chilling, focused on his tailoring stuff. While going through the letters, Frances found one from this group called The Outfit. Sounds mysterious, right? Anyway, Richie mentioned that he had asked Mr. Leonard to step out because they needed some privacy. Out in the lobby, Mabel was showing Mr. Leonard a cool snowball, saying a friend had given it to her. Mabel's really into these snowballs that have famous places inside, like the Eiffel Tower or Big Ben, because she dreams of seeing the world. She expressed her amazement to Mr. Leonard about him choosing to set up shop in Chicago when he could have done so anywhere else. After Richie and Frances left, Mr. Leonard mentioned to Mabel that the man from the neighboring clock shop wanted to meet her. Mabel, however, indicated she wasn't interested and hinted she was interested in someone else. Mr. Leonard, noticing their interactions before, surmised she was referring to Richie. While tidying up, he cautioned Mabel about Richie's associations with shady characters, possibly the Mafia. Mabel acknowledged being aware of the Boyles and their reputation, but believed she could manage her relationship with Richie. So, Mabel expressed her desire to travel the world and asked Mr. Leonard for a raise. In response, Mr. Leonard suggested she needed to improve her performance, even questioning her ability to fold a washcloth properly. After they closed up for the day, Mabel headed home, but Mr. Leonard stayed back. He had more stuff to do. He dozed off at his desk, having these intense dreams about his family and some fiery scenes. But then he's jolted awake by the sound of his shop's door. Guess who? It's Mabel and Richie just hanging out. Looks like Mr. Leonard was right about those two all along. So Richie's spilling the beans to Mabel about his brother, Francis. Apparently, Francis thinks there's a mole in their family snitching to some rival gang, La Fontaine. Richie, not a fan of Francis. He's a bit salty because his dad, Roy Boyle, always had Francis' back, even more than Richie's. He felt like Francis was just some dude who once saved his dad from getting shot up, and maybe his dad only kept Francis close because he felt like he owed him. Meanwhile, Mr. Leonard's trying to be sneaky, eavesdropping on their chat, but he drops something and makes a noise. He quickly acts like he's asleep when they notice. Mabel, being the considerate soul she is, ushers Richie out, not wanting to disturb Mr. Leonard's sleep. A few days later, Richie and Francis drop by Leonard's shop, like they usually do, to grab their mail. This time, they find a letter and a cassette from that Mafia group, The Outfit. Then, they're out of there real quick, gotta tell Mr. Roy the news. But plot twist, they're back at Leonard's shop super fast that same night. Richie's been shot in the belly. Francis rushes him to Leonard's back room. He quickly gives Mr. Roy a call to let him know they've been ambushed by the La Fontaine crew and they're laying low at the shop. Mr. Roy promises to get there ASAP. At this intense moment, Francis asked Mr. Leonard if he could assist in stopping Richie's bleeding. Mr. Leonard, even though he's never done this kind of thing before, remembers some of his old combat days and gives it a shot, no pun intended. Poor Richie's out cold, especially since they had to do all this without any painkillers. But Mr. Leonard, being the champ he is, manages to stop the bleeding. Francis took the tape from the suitcase and asked Mr. Leonard to watch over Richie for a while. However, Mr. Leonard declined, expressing that he wanted no involvement in the Boyle family's issues. But Francis insists, saying Leonard's shop is the safest spot right now. Francis then spills the beans, that tape. It's got recordings from a wiretap, like a secret bug, probably planted by someone in the Boyle family working with the FBI. The plan was to play the tape somewhere else, but the LaFontaine gang jumped them before they could, which is how Richie got shot. Now, with many Mafia groups wanting that tape to mess up the Boyles, Francis is in a rush to find a cassette player to figure out who in their family's playing double agent. Soon after Francis left in a hurry, Richie regained consciousness. Mr. Leonard, with a serious expression, conveyed to Richie that he had been informed about the tapes and the betrayal by Francis. Curious, he asks Richie if he's got any guesses about who the mole in their family might be. After a pause, Mr. Leonard revealed the possibility that the informant might be someone close, but not a Boyle family member. To Richie's surprise, Mr. Leonard then claimed he was the informant. Richie was momentarily shocked, but then laughed off the revelation, dismissing the idea that Mr. Leonard, whom he mistook as just a tailor, could betray them. Mr. Leonard corrected him with pride, stating that he wasn't just a tailor, but a cutter trained at the prestigious fashion institution, The Row, before starting his own venture. Then, shifting the conversation, Mr. Leonard suggested the idea that the real traitor might be Francis, given his intense focus on finding the informant. Soon after, Francis strolls back into the shop, but here's the twist. Mr. Leonard had already whispered to him that Richie was throwing some major side-eye his way, thinking he might be the traitor. Plus, Richie had snooped in that suitcase Francis left behind. So basically, Mr. Leonard's got these two doubting each other big time. When Francis entered, Richie, clearly agitated by what Mr. Leonard had mentioned earlier, questioned why he was the only one injured in the shootout while Francis was unharmed. Francis just shrugs it off, saying he must have been lucky. Francis is eager to play the tape immediately, but Richie insists on waiting for their father. Things get super tense, and the two start squabbling over the tape. Then they realize the suitcase is empty. Both whip out guns, pointing them at each other. Richie takes a shot and misses, but Francis nails Richie right in the neck, taking him down. In a panic, Francis starts tearing the place apart, looking for that hidden tape. Soon after, Mr. Roy and his crew rolled up to Mr. Leonard's place. He was pretty freaked out and quickly told Mr. Leonard to stash Richie's body somewhere and to clean up the blood. By the time Mr. Roy came inside, the mess was all cleaned up, and Francis was ready with a story. He said Richie took off with that important tape and didn't tell him where he was headed. Mr. Roy, clearly worried, told Francis to hustle and track Richie down. While waiting, Mr. Roy got chatty with Mr. Leonard. He spilled about this big Mafia group called the Outfit that's got connections all over Europe and the US. He said the Outfit made an offer to team up with the Boyles since they were the only ones brave enough to stand up to this other gang, LaFontaine. The Outfit even tossed them a bone by sending over the tape that could help them suss out a traitor in their midst. Mr. Leonard questioned why he was being informed about all these details, especially since he knew Mr. Roy to typically be more secretive with information. But here's the thing. Mr. Roy had noticed Richie's coat hanging up, and he knew Richie wouldn't head out in the cold without it. So Mr. Roy had a hunch that Mr. Leonard was hiding something. Mr. Roy was furious and pointed his gun at Mr. Leonard, demanding the truth. But before Mr. Leonard could say anything, Francis burst in with Mabel. Seeing Mabel in danger, Mr. Leonard quickly made up a story. He said Richie felt down because Francis had taken out 4 of LaFontaine's guys, while Richie didn't get any. So, to prove himself to his dad, Richie went to LaFontaine's territory to take some of them down. And the reason Mr. Leonard didn't spill the beans earlier? Richie made him promise not to tell so Mr. Roy wouldn't freak out. Puzzled, Mr. Roy inquired about the reason for Mabel's presence. Francis chimed in, suggesting that Richie might have run to Mabel's place since they were an item. Mr. Roy then turned to Mabel, asking if she knew where Richie was hiding. But Mabel genuinely had no clue. Francis, not making things any easier, pointed out there was blood on Mabel's rug, maybe Richie's. Mr. Roy, now even more riled up, started pressuring Mabel to spill any info she had. Mr. Leonard jumped in, trying to cool things down. He revealed a painful part of his past. He once had a wife and kid, but they died in a tragic fire. So in his eyes, Mabel was like the daughter he lost. Suddenly, the phone rang. Mr. Leonard answered it and said Richie was on the line. According to Mr. Leonard, Richie was hiding out from LaFountain's gang and needed a ride from Street 31. Mr. Roy didn't waste any time and rushed out with his crew to fetch Richie, leaving Francis behind to keep an eye on Mr. Leonard and Mabel. With Mr. Roy gone, Mr. Leonard spilled the beans. He had given that address as a trap, hoping LaFountain's crew would ambush Mr. Roy, the real kicker. Mabel was the inside source, the traitor. After getting close to Richie, Mabel got all sorts of dirt on the Boyle family. She then shared this with LaFountain to make some quick cash. Knowing that the Boyles, especially Francis, would eventually catch on, she reached out to the FBI. Her plan? Get the feds to tap their phones and then arrest the lot of them. That way, she'd be safe, and the Boyles would be out of the picture. Mr. Leonard knew about Mabel's big plan, but he let it slide because he understood her dreams of traveling and needing money for it. Plus, he was the one who hid the tapes to keep Mabel safe. Not long after, LaFountain and his crew showed up at Leonard's shop. They were there to buy the tape from Mabel. Francis had a plan, though. He whispered to Mr. Leonard and Mabel about a little signal. Once they got the money from LaFountain, they were supposed to give the sign. Then Francis would jump out and take down LaFountain. But things didn't go as planned. After Mabel got paid and handed over the tape, she and Mr. Leonard ratted Francis out to LaFountain. Poor Francis didn't stand a chance. LaFountain's guys shot him down right there. With the drama done and LaFountain gone, Mr. Leonard dropped another bombshell. The tape LaFountain took. A fake. Mr. Leonard had swapped it out with a recording of his own voice. The real tape. Still with Mr. Leonard. His big plan was to stir up trouble between the Boyles. He wanted both the Boyle Mafia and LaFountain's crew to be taken down by the FBI. And the real tape was the key to making that happen. He told Mabel to use her new money to see the world. That night, Mr. Leonard was busy packing up. He then lit a fire to wipe out all the clues from his shop. But Francis wasn't out of the game yet. He jumped up, took a shot at Mr. Leonard, but only grazed his arm. With the tension high, Mr. Leonard spilled his life story to Francis. Turns out he used to be in the mob game, just like Francis. But after ditching his boss and moving to London, the past caught up. His boss's crew tracked him down and, in a tragic fire, took his family away. So he shifted to Chicago, trying to turn over a new leaf. The movie wraps up with Mr. Leonard walking away from his Chicago shop, hoping for a fresh start. So the moral of the story is always double-check your snowball collection, because you never know when the world's most secretive tailors and fashion aficionados might be hiding more than just snazzy suits. And remember, a past with fiery tragedies might just inspire a life of sneaky tape swaps and mobster takedowns.